We're now in for a great treat. Tim Holt Wilson is, without question, the most interesting person in Norfolk.
Sorry, I'll be...
He is a geoconservationist, and he's going to give us a little bit. He's going to give us a little bit of the geological context for some of the art that comes from extraction in the Norfolk landscape. Tim, thank you.
Thank you. I don't want to hear me, okay? Okay. Right you are. Well, let's start this session with that most ubiquitous of geological materials, sand. Its grains clothe the surface of the earth in so many places. It's tempting to think of sand as a sort of thing, whereas what I want to invite you to do is to think of it more in terms of process. It evidently plays a big role in the landscape of West Norfolk. Sands and sandstones and flint-rich gravels are the major quarry products of the area. They've all got one thing in common, which is silica, which is a tough and resistant mineral made of molecules of silicon dioxide. These molecules have survived billions of years in various forms since it first crystallized out as quartz from the liquid magma of the cooling fireball Earth. Quartz can be eroded by wind and water and other agents of erosion to form the grainy detritus that we call sand. This picture here shows sands from the Lesiot beds of the Sandringham Sands Formation, deposited at the bottom of a shallow sea, perhaps 130 million years ago, at a time when iguanodon and baryonyx and polycanthus were trotting around the river deltas of southern England, and ichthyosaurs were swimming the seas. Almost all fossils have been destroyed in the Lesiot sands. What we see here, these strange knobbly ironstone concretions formed when iron sulfide nodules derived from organic decay products in the sediment have been transformed into iron oxides and hydroxides, which is what are cementing the sands there. They are a reminder of the purely physical nature of silica and that it once hosted living things on the seabed, and that the alchemy wrought by chemicals of biological origin can create interesting phenomena such as this ferruginous concretion. St. Lawrence's Church at Castle Rising has another form of visual and chemical poetry wrought in sand. Grey blocks of the silver car that you see there were dug from local quarries many hundreds of years ago, and they're the rock upon which this church is founded. Silver car is incredibly tough because it is made of quartz sand cemented by quartz. Chemically, it's not much different from the Lesiot sands that we saw in the last slide, but with the addition of extra silica precipitated out within the last million years or so, we think. It was tough enough, certainly, for the Romans to use it to armour the exterior walls of their fortress at Branadunum, which is known as Brancaster to us. Just above the silver car, we can see in the wall there blocks of dark brown iron-rich ferricrete. This formed in local bogs where iron oxide was precipitated out of groundwater by chemical and biological action. Another example of chemical and biological processes working hand in hand together. Now, I mentioned the word precipitated. Let's have a look a bit more at some precipitation. Some of this site may be familiar to some of you, lucky people. Okay, well, precipitation certainly adds to our local geological story. Down in the common, at Ling Common, something is brewing in a ditch. Groundwater rich in dissolved iron, ferrous iron, seeping out of the Lesiot sands and emerges in this ditch. Reaching the air, the ferrous iron is converted to ferric iron and is precipitated out as a phenomenal reddish-brown, gloopy mineral known as ferrihydrite. Iron-fixing bacteria, such as Thiobacillus ferrooxidans, are having a feast here too. They're able to get energy from metabolizing iron. We can see the byproducts of this activity as the rainbow colours dazzling us on the surface film of the water. X-ray analysis of the ferrihydrite shows that it is composed of nanoparticles so small and complex that we cannot still even be sure of the structure of the molecule. This mysterious mineral is truly an example of what Kate Walker, who was here somewhere, there she is, calls Van Dyke brown, in other words, brown of the ditch. We can collect it, we can sieve it and dry the residue, to make an excellent brown ochre pigment. I can vouch for the fact that it definitely stains fingers and clothes. Precipitates. More precipitation in action here at the bottom of a West Norfolk quarry. A wondrous froth of chemical and biological action is unfolding in this puddle. Groundwater, rich in dissolved ferrous iron, seeps out of the quarry wall, meets the air, and its iron precipitates out as orange ferrihydrite. Meanwhile, the bacteria are busy brewing up their own colourful alchemy, dying in their millions to produce rainbow colours as they metabolise the dissolved iron. Floating bubbles are further evidence of ancient earth processes at work, perhaps underwater algae busy respiring in the summer sunlight. Here is some mineral-rich peat. It took about 3,500 years for absolute sea levels to rise at the end of the last cold period. The Dogger Bank Island was finally drowned about then. Meanwhile, in West Norfolk, water levels were backing up in the river valleys, causing swamps and wet woodlands to develop. Peat was laid down in the plant-rich, oxygen-starved conditions: moss peat, reed peat, wood peat, along with the remains of animal life. At the base of the peat, just above the late glacial deposits, a layer which started out as a complex spongy mush of iron, manganese and phosphorus minerals, as well as peat, began maturing into a hard pan. Plant matter rotted out in the acidic conditions, and crunchy oxides and hydroxides such as goethite were precipitated, along with pale blue hydrated iron phosphate, vivianite, which you can see here. Will-o'-the-wisps and hobby lanterns would have flickered over these swamps. Mysterious minerals such as vivianite are more examples of the intriguing beauty and alchemy in nature, which members of the Groundwork Network are drawing inspiration and materials from, with such fascinating results. So it's over to Sophie King and her presentation, I believe.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
So if I click next.
Oh, thank you very much, Tim. You didn't have to do that.
Are you ready to go? I'm just struck by a couple of lines there that Tim's left us with: a wondrous froth of chemical and biological action producing rainbow colours. And then he captured my intellect with a complex spongy mush. Thank you very much, Tim. So now we are indeed over to Sophie King, who continues this very same theme in film form.
Sound.
Investigating the intersection of human activity with the non-human through sculpture, installation and film. My practice considers the Anthropocene, deep time and vibrant matter, searching for an understanding of ecological systems, processes and phenomena in relation to the environmental crises. And I joined the Groundwork cohort in 2023. Groundwork's 2023 extraction residency brought together 10 artists in an intensive programme of field trip and conversation, culminating in an exhibition. I came on the residency interested in the rewilding of land and remediation after extraction. I initially imagined an artwork based on making some sort of gift to the land. I found myself based at the Grange with Nicola Streeton and John Plowman, where the atmosphere encourages research through practice. The urge to get on and make work was hard to resist, and as the rewilding trips came later on in the schedule, so I ended up responding to the field trips as they happened. The very first trip that we went on to was the Sedgwick Museum, where very patiently Dr. Liz Hyde opened every case for us, a bunch of feral artists / geography nerds. The John Watson Building Stones collection was particularly seductive. A collection of stones all perfectly shaped and smooth, with beautifully consistent handwritten labels housed in bespoke cabinetry. Once our aesthetic intoxication wore off, we recognized the words above the stones. Specimens of colonial and foreign building stones. This was enough to bring me up short and to question what sort of society it was that had brought us this beguiling sense of order and tidiness. Aesthetically, I love the collection instinct, the classifying, sorting, and separating, the compulsion of drawers filled with just one thing over and over again. Somehow this sort of order feels calming. It's so in control. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized how perverse it is to study the world in this very discrete, separate way, when reality is so convoluted, so messy and involved, so very complicated. I was looking hard for a piece of furniture to represent the museum when John found me an old set of drawers from his workshop. And over the next 2 weeks, this inanimate object took on a character and life of its own. Eventually, it coalesced in the gallery as the Museum of the Vibrant Collector, comprising drawers, fossils, flint, sand, Carrett's pendula, all with AI-generated scientific terms, and an animation that I will show you later. I had begun to think about alternative future and speculative realities. The philosopher Jane Bennett's concept of vibrant matter and Susan Simard's Wood Wide Web influenced these propositions, and their ideas are very much informing my work subsequent to the residency. The exhibition installation sees a museum cabinet regurgitating its amalgamated discoveries for our perusal. It interrogates Western scientific inquiry's capitalist, colonialist mindset, the futility of studying one part of a system in isolation, recognizing interconnectedness, and embracing the chaotic, messy beauty of our biosphere and deep time frame. This work is a positive affirmation that a non-extractive, regenerative response to the world is possible. The flint that I collected from around the Grange has an appealing resemblance to bones and fossils, but it also carries a huge resonance of human activities, the vernacular houses and walls of the last several hundred years, and for millennia earlier flint tools and weapons. These stories of our histories are held in the fabric of the stones, but are still just a tiny fragment of the whole existence that they had before we appeared. The plants here are a sedge. In my family, we call them the enemy plant for their invasive nature in our urban garden. But here at the Grange, they know their place, kept in check by the rich ecosystem of which they're just a part. It blew my mind that on the trip to the quarry, Peter Lemon showed us fossils lying in the waste pile. "Come on," he said, "my wife's picked up bags full of these, you can have some more." So I added genuine mammoth teeth and assorted fossils to my museum collection. The quarry itself was strangely beautiful, sculptural, mounds of sand, gravel, rock. Like the Sedgwick, it deals in separation, classification, and collection. The spent quarries become lakes teeming with wildlife, it seems possible to follow a sustainable best practice to create new habitat where we've destroyed the last one. What is it that makes this happen? Why does it happen in this case? And more to the point, how can we make this happen in mines and quarries over the world? We are drops in the ocean here. The frustration is that it seems so easy to influence things adversely, but takes so much more effort to positively change the system. I think of how things are better than the 70s. Vegetarians aren't considered cranks. You can't legally be turned away from a job or housing because of the colour of your skin. Anthropocentric climate change is widely accepted as a fact. But also, all these things are still on the agenda around the world to be argued about. Right now, it feels like all progress can be reversed. Does any of this even matter in the face of biodiversity collapse and global heating? I wonder how we classify our actions and calculate the worth when everything we do is contributing to this hyperobject that is our planet and timeline. Tim Holt-Wilson talked to us about the underlying geology of the area and its intimate connection with the soil, plants, and wildlife above. Everything is connected, with each part of the system existing within its own time frame. These rocks don't care about climate change, he said, which was weirdly comforting in a way. The animation that accompanies my gallery installation follows the museum cabinet, which awakens in a post-human world. Following a cultural memory, it gathers and classifies its world. As an integral part of the environment, it collects in a more inclusive way, inviting exhibits to join it freely, while it ponders the meaning of the dry definitions it has coded into its thinking. So, thank you, and I will leave you watching.
How wonderful to hear the song of the blackbird and be reminded of warm, long days to come. Now, as many of you know, Amanda Warwick is unable to be with us today, so we pass straight to Caroline Chula-Tissier, whose work and words will inform us on the subject and the material of play.
Trying to stay forward for Henry. Good afternoon. My name's Caroline Chula-Tissier. I'm delighted to be here despite how I feel inside. And after that, I'd kind of rather not go next. But I just wanted to, in a way, start with a celebration, really, of what Veronica and the Groundwork Gallery are allowing us to do to explore these fundamental questions, really, of how us as humans have chosen to live in the world, either in connection or disconnection with the environment. I moved to Norwich in 2022 from a gritstone dark peak and white alkaline limestone peak of Derbyshire via 2 years during COVID at the RCA, grappling to an attempt to get an MA in ceramics and glass. And I engaged with a dialogue with a loss and long-term emotional effects of early bereavement that I should have dealt with a long time ago, and explored the part that played in my life by the raw northern landscape that I'd been experiencing for the last 25 years. I named the graduation show The Ground Beneath Your Feet before I'd met Veronica, and was unexpectedly awarded a bursary in recognition of the work that I'd done, and that was all very, very exciting. And so from a very wet Derbyshire, I came to an even very wetter or more watery East Anglia, and Norwich was a region that I didn't know anything about until the comprehensive tour that was our very lucky experience for the Groundwork residency with Tim and the whole host of other amazing people that take us on a tour, from the beaver dams to the inland dunes, and nicely named The Ground Beneath Our Feet. The residency for me has helped me focus on three main questions. Veronica earlier was talking about what questions we can put together, and my questions have become the following. So, how can I share the solace I get from my connection with nature through my artwork? How can I embrace a regenerative process through the responsibility of an art practice that responds to that? And how can I support the generosity of spirit of this new network community that Veronica is very successfully growing? And the pieces on the slide at the moment, on the left-hand side is a piece I made in response to an experience in October 2022 of the floods. I don't know if you remember the very, very heavy rain that we had. And it was a landscape underwater as we desperately headed north again, and along a swamped and flooded A47, scared for the safety of us in that moment, but also worried about the future, that we may live on a hill in Norwich, one of the hills, but it's irrelevant because the water is all around you, and the experience of that, even if you're lucky enough to be up on a hill, nothing can happen. Everything is affected by it. So the left-hand piece was exhibited in the exhibition before the residency, and then the third picture is a piece called Conduit, which is a piece I've made since, using a very fragmented, broken clay process, extruding the clay, but also combining different elements of clays that I've gathered. And the second and the fourth are samples of clay that I took from Wild Ken Hill and attempted to use in a very painterly way in a very low-fired kiln firing, because obviously the elephant in the room when you make ceramics is the nightmare scenario that it has to be fired if you're going to change it. So I'm really grappling with that, and any other ceramics people in the room. It's an unanswered question as yet, if you're going to fire your work. And the last image is samples that we took from Peter's quarry. And the Vivianite is the second down, and it was a beautiful dark blue, and through a really low firing of 850 degrees has revealed what we all have is a lot of iron. And so it's beautiful, but it's not blue. I have brought the samples. They're on the back if people want to have a look at some of them. Go have a look afterwards. Before I change the slides, my next slide, in May in 2024, we took part in the residency tour down to Dorset. We followed the chalk line, which was very exciting. Down to East Anglia, from East Anglia to Dorset, to Amanda Warwork's studio, who sadly can't be here. But her studio in Bridport is called the Old Forge, is that right? Is that the old? No, the old timber yard. And I think you might be going again? Yeah, so that was an amazing experience because it took us all down to a new area that where the cliffs and the rock formations they have just such another massive story down there. Amanda works with a geologist called Sam Scriven. Sam Scriven. Very important to get surnames right, isn't it, guys? Especially the women's surnames, because Amanda was introduced as Amanda, and this is our geologist, Sam Scriven. So he had a full name, she was just Amanda. So remember that. During his Jurassic walk, he talked about the main differences between the layered stones and the water levels, and how they'd changed over the millions of years, and how the sand and the silt and the clay had all gathered. One of the questions right at the end was, so what's the difference between sand and clay then? And I was standing there thinking, do you know, it's a question I've long known. I've wanted to ask this. You know, I trained in 1980 something. Clay is the thing you get in bags. And in 1980, you very much didn't go and dig it yourself because you had to have a full-grown beard and like I'm managing that now, but anyway. So this is the slide. So it's very, very tediously written out, but it just excites me a lot because it shows the variety of sizes, also the way that they're shown and explained, but also the clay is so small. The particles are they're so different. Sam was explaining that sand can go down to a certain size and then it can't get any smaller. Is that right? Unless you crush it. But clay, you've got this massive range of character, and right from being a small child, that's the thing that just excited me. The clay particles are they're the slippiest and the most flexible of all material, and I don't know about moss actually. I need to talk to Lucy about whether moss is, as flexible. It sounds like it might be, but it just gives you possibilities, and it's just a very, very exciting bit of information. And knowing, I think what Veronica's residency did was it gave us so much information, and it, as I kept telling my kids when they were doing their GCSEs, it's all fascinating. everything. It's all fascinating. And we would go through this week-long, we had 4 weeks, didn't we, of input. And we all just came back very, very excited about all this new information. And that excitement and knowledge drives that emotional buy-in. And, if we're going to instigate any kind of change, it has to be an emotional buy-in. And Sophie's animation did that. She charms you. There's humour, and it's not the weird one that you want to stay away from. You want more of that, and that's part of what I'm saying, I think. Sam also talked about during the conference in the evening the loss of lifestyle, that he thought it was the biggest sort of hurdle for us to get over was an acceptance of a loss of lifestyle. And how do you do that? How do we change right from now that loss, how do we accept that loss of lifestyle? So that's one of the things that we could think about as one of those questions too. So how am I doing for time? Okay. This slide goes through a lot of things about temperature changes, trying to adapt those. It goes through iron, that's okay, we've done that. It also talks about how we make use of material. I did a project working with somebody's cremated ashes and undoing the bag and having the grains and the ash on the table. It's not really ash, is it? It's granular. Every single part of that was precious. And I was lucky enough this summer to stay at the Watch House for 3 nights. Thank you, Margie. And the Watch House, you can't leave anything. You have to carry everything there, and you have to take everything away. And believe me, when you do it, you certainly clear your plate where at the end of, because there is no bin. You can't just leave stuff around. You have to be responsible. We all have to be responsible when you go to the Watch House, and I'm trying to do that as part of my work. I'm trying to be responsible in my studio. I'm trying to reuse all the shards I make. I'm trying to not reuse, I'm trying to incorporate, I'm trying to give them importance. And there's a piece on the back that is a circular piece with slop and silt from the bottom of the bucket. I haven't got a sink. I recycle everything, and I'm trying to incorporate that in my material. And if I can't not fire, if I'm going to fire, then I'm going to be responsible about what I do. And I'm going to try and talk about it, and I think that's probably is the best that I can do for now.
Thank you, Caroline, for that heartfelt treatment of clay. Was that the Watch House on Blakeney Point?
It was, yes.
Oh my goodness me! Have any of you been? The most utterly beautiful place, and a landscape surrounded by chalk, by clay, because the salt marshes behind the point settle there. They're the finest sediments in the sea, and they only settle at the point of zero energy at the top of the tide behind a spit like Blakeney Point. So you were in a clay-rich landscape and seascape. It is the most beautiful place. If you ever go, there's one little beach hut left on the end which belongs to my great uncle. We're one of the last families left with one of the huts on the end of the point. Now we pass to Sam Hodge, who continues with the theme of earth pigments.
I've been working with found earth and rock to make pigments for a few years now, and this connects me to particular environments in a very physical way. Walking, looking, finding, collecting, grinding, sieving and mullering with medium to make paint is a slow and mindful process. The earth smells, feels, sounds and looks a certain way, doing things to me as I do things to it. It carries with it memories and stories of the place I found it. A lot of my earth is gathered on my walks around the coast of England, and this is a place where geology is exposed and where the shifting nature of the environment and human efforts to change or maintain it are both very apparent. These are photos. In this photos, there's the cliffs at Hunstanton on the left, and a selection of coloured earths that I collected in 2023 with groundwork from Hunstanton and also from the cliffs between East and West Runton. And there's me in my studio making Hunstanton red chalk into pigment and paint. So I really like that this conference is called Ground Up, because grinding up is exactly what I do with the things I find beneath my feet. So even though I actually wasn't officially, strictly speaking, an artist in residence with groundwork, Veronica's generosity meant that I tagged along on several of the visits arranged for the residents in 2023, and I've had the opportunity to get to know many of the artists and exhibit with them again this year. Both the visits and my communication with the other artists have had a big impact on my thinking about my own work and about art and the environment more generally. Tim's geology walk was the most influential thing, kind of mind-blowing, really. It gave me the sense of ongoing movement, disruption and creation going on over vast geological time. And I had a sudden vertiginous sense of the deepness of time and also of the fluidity of the earth beneath my feet. I loved his stories of different geological eras and processes and the way they feed into everything in the landscape and into our interactions with it. Tim's description of the microbes that are precipitating iron in bogs really brought home to me the amount of biology that there is in geology, which he was talking about earlier. There really isn't a hard boundary between the two. A lot of the earths I find are red, yellow, or rich brown colours produced by different iron compounds, and I had assumed the processes that made them were inorganic. But it is amazing to me that they may have actually been formed partly by biological activity in the past. Life depends on geology, but life has also created a lot of geology. Living creatures form the chalk, flints and peat which underlie much of Norfolk, while bones of mammoths and other animals pop out of the cliffs at Runton or are revealed in Peter's quarries, where they make the beautiful blue Vivianite pigment as they react with iron-rich water. While I was in Norfolk, visits to the coast and to quarries gave me some new material to work with, and these two paintings, with collage parts to them as well, were made with peat washed up on Hunstanton Beach and earths from the Runton Cliffs. This one on this side, the peat, and on the other one, earth pigment mixed with gum arabic, were dropped into a pool of water on paper and allowed to flow into as the paper buckled and then dry into tide lines. And then the branching patterns were made by pressing and pulling apart paint medium and then taking a print from this onto thin tissue and sprinkling earth pigments and chalk from West and East Runton onto the wet paint medium and then collaged over the top of the paintings. So in my work, I like to collaborate with the materials in what I like to think is a dance of reciprocal activity. I encourage the paint to flow, deposit, erode, and respond to pressure. Complex, often organic-looking patterns emerge from physical processes, in some ways analogous to the kind of processes that are happening in geological processes. So I select and combine these to create ambiguous new forms open to animation by our imagination, I hope. So thank you also to Peter for his fantastic guided tour of his quarries, which I'm glad that somebody at least showed a photograph of. These quarries really brought home to me the extent to which humans are now a force of geological scale change as we move huge quantities of stuff around in this Anthropocene era. We are changing the earth and the climate, but also still we are very much subject to the forces of nature as sea levels rise. So this painting and collage is made with materials which were all gathered at the base of the fast eroding cliffs between West and East Runton. These cliffs are a crumbling jumble of rock types, out of which tumble animal bones, teeth and shells from interglacial periods. These are mixed up with human-made objects, from ancient flint tools to the contents of buildings, that were until recently perched on the cliff tops above. So in this painting, ink is made with copper pipes and a piece of rusty grate from fallen houses have been dropped into pools of water on paper. The copper and rust solutions flow, settle, and interact with each other. The rust reacts with oxygen. The copper crystallizes as it dries. The branching patterns are made with pigments from copper, chalk, and earth. The work is a result of cycles of activity over different timescales, some of it human and some of it not. So the copper dug from mines and made into pipes through which the water flowed into houses now fallen, merges on paper with chalk. This was made by coccoliths in Cretaceous oceans, crushed beneath later rock strata, lifted up by tectonic activity, revealed by erosion, and transported by glaciers to East Runton, and then by me into this painting. Materials carry stories, but ones playing out over very different temporalities. So now for something quite different. This is a collection of prints taken from unfolded cardboard packaging in inks made with earth collected from the Norfolk coast, mixed with linseed oil. I roll the ink onto the packets and then run them through a press to transfer the impression of the packet onto damp paper. So this installation of prints was actually in an exhibition curated by Catherine Regina Fell in Holt in this summer, with some ceramics by Jackie Ramriker. So the visit to the Sedgwick Museum, which Sophie wonderfully talked about in her talk, and also getting to know Sophie and Amanda Woolwork's work in particular, made me think more about collecting and collections. We need to be critical of an acquisitive accumulation of stuff and of the quest to control by ordering and categorizing that created such collections. And yet, there is also a joy in collecting and in naming, understanding, and showing. For me, also the serendipity of finding is an important part of the way I interact with the environment. I go to a place carrying with me my own set of interests, and the place then presents me with things as presents, as gifts. I used to have a problem with using colour in my work before I started making my own pigments. Colours seem so arbitrary. Why one colour rather than another? But now I am given colours by the environment and I make the best of them. The search for colour also makes me see landscape in a different way, teaching me about the matter of it and giving me geological, biological and human stories along with my colours. The colours I collect mean something to me. This is so different from the experience of buying paint in a tube, where I can select from a dazzling array of colours that people have synthesised, prepared, packages tested, marketed and transported. I have to speak quickly now. Working through hidden networks of global trade, too complicated for me to understand, but so easy for me to squeeze out of the tube and use. Even the so-called earth pigments are now synthesised from iron and other metals and given P numbers. Each grain of pigment in a batch is exactly the same intense colour as every other one. In contrast, the natural earths always contain variety and so have a softness and subtlety to them. Natural earths also behave in unpredictable, sometimes creative and sometimes quite annoying ways. How much more have I got? So these set of unfolded boxes are also obviously a collection. I have a fascination for bits of rubbish, and I've been collecting cardboard packaging since lockdown, when I had nothing better to do than look at the contents of my recycling bin. So in 2022, I began combining them, and at first I didn't do this with the aim of saying something about either of them, but just thinking, what will happen if I put these things together? And so I think working with groundwork has helped me interpret what has come out of their combination. Just 2 more paragraphs? Yeah. The shapes seem very human-made, the product of intentional design, very different from my more organic work with paint processes. These box patterns were designed to be folded up and to contain, carry and protect a consumer good. But once the function is over, they are unfolded and thrown away to start a life that they were not designed for, changing the environment and being changed by it. There is a poignant contrast in temporalities between the short-lived boxes and the earths, which were created millions of years ago. For me, these shapes represent other ephemeral human structures made to contain and protect, particularly defences against the sea and human invasion that are scattered all along the coast. But I hope that the familiar yet strange and ambiguous shapes encourage the viewer to make their own connections. So, no time for my conclusion, but never mind.
Sam, that was wonderful, and thank you for sharing those gorgeous images with us. I'm absolutely struck by the fact that most of the materials you work with from which you make pigments have in some way been made or shaped or moved or corroded by the sea. And you have created these, I'm sure you thought the same, Charlie, you were talking about coral reefs. Those are coral reefs. These, despite the fact that 120 million years ago the pigments in the lower cliffs of Hunstanton were laid down, they're coming alive again as coral reefs. The vulnerable coral reefs that in a 3-degree warming world we will lose altogether. Now, our final artist of today is Liz War McManus, who's speaking to us of her materials, sand and glass.
Right, hi. So I'm an artist who specialises in glass and also in interactive media, so digital stuff and electronics. My focus for the residency was on the extraction of silica, and it's one of my primary materials used in multiple ways, not only in the glass itself, but in the refractory moulds where it's added to plaster for glass casting, and actually in the silicon chips in the microcontrollers that I use. And this residency really helped me to understand my material better. I actually teach through arts projects young people about the provenance of like common materials like the textiles or paper, and the environmental cost of actually processing raw materials to make these. But I realised that I knew quite very little about how silica sand is extracted, and I didn't have any practical experience in using sand to make glass. Because I always buy ready-made glass cullet, which is basically lumps of sand, or I'm actually using recycled glass cullet. So during our research week with Tim Holt-Wilson, we had a trip to Castle Rising and to Lynn Common and the Dursingen Bog that we've seen earlier to learn about local geology. Including the Lesiot Sands, which is, you can see on the map up there, the area to the east of King's Lynn, where the Lesiot sandbeds and Mintlin sandbeds are. Now, Lesiot is actually very, very pure silica, not quite as pure as some Scottish silica, but it's one of the only, I think, 1 out of 6 sites in the UK which is suitable for making clear glass, colourless glass. I visited Subelco. We didn't have a grand tour like we did with Peter's wonderful quarry, but this is Subelco in the image, which is where they quarry most of the, well, over half the glass sand for the glass industry. Every day there are trains transporting from Subelco to the north of England to Ardagh Glass in Barnley, which makes container glass, or to the Guardian Glass in Goole, which makes float glass, window glass for architecture. So over half the sand, glass sand in the UK comes from around here. Right, okay. The story of the Earth is told in its geology, and we know that many chemicals that make up our planet were formed directly in the stars. We've already heard about iron. Silica dust is actually found throughout the universe. Astronomer Jongi Rowe and her team discovered that the source of this cosmic silica dust is supernova remnants, dying stars that run out of energy and then explode, producing such heat that the silicon and oxygen gets fused into silicon dioxide. silica sand. So when we look through our windows or at glass art or in our glasses, we're actually looking at silica that formed billions of years ago in exploding stars, which I find really cool. The artwork on the left there is called Supernova and makes this connection between the particles of silica in the dust of supernovas and its journey to the Earth's crust, which is made up of 60% silica. The form of this artwork uses data from a real supernova called Cassiopeia B, and it's a tactile representation of X-ray data from the Chandra X-ray Observatory. I was helped with the digital files for creating this by a visually impaired astronomer who's making astronomical data tactile to make it more accessible for people with visual impairments. And so he provided me with a digital file which I 3D printed and then moulded for casting the glass. So you can see also up there, if I've got time, there's a little bit of Libyan sand sea glass, which is actually when a giant asteroid hit the desert and turned kilometres into glass, which is like very, very early, before humans made it. Okay. This is Sand Train, and it's about the journey of the extracted glass, sand, to the glass factories. It's actually made out of recycled glass, which I gathered when I was first starting to work in glass from Caithness Crystal, which used to have a branch here in King's Lynn. And I've still got some left over in my workshop, so I used it for this. And I cast it in sand, which was given me in several buckets from the Sibelco quarry, and which is also a nod to the fact that a lot of the sand around here was actually extracted for foundry glass when it wasn't good enough for having, did I say foundry glass? For foundry sand, for casting metals in. When you visit the gallery, this is on the wall, when you touch it, you'll actually hear two sounds. One is a sound recording from 1998 of the sand train passing through Middleton Towers, which is local. And the other sound is a sonification of data from a supernova. So it's making those two connections and how our world is very interconnected. And then finally, during the second residency week, I spent a lot of time looking up the history of glassmaking in the King's Lynn area, from medieval times right up to the 21st century. I don't have time to actually go into this very much. I'll definitely get one of those signs. But I'll say a few things which interest me. I hope they interest you. So sand was quarried here in medieval times. I found a reference to Queen Isabella, who was living at Castle Rising Castle, writing in about 1335 about sand being carried to King's Lynn. I don't know whether this was actually for making into glass or for some other purpose, but there was actually a record of, I think it was John de Vere, a French glassmaker who was working in King's Lynn in 1300. In Victorian times, there were horse-drawn trams which transported the sand from Castle Rising, and eventually there was a quarry at Mintlin Sands, which was established in the 1880s by Joseph Bohm, and by the 1930s, 750,000 imperial tons per year were transported in three-wheeled wagons pulled by a steam engine to Purfleet Quay in Lynn to eventually go to Newcastle and Sunderland, which I was interested in because I've just finished at the University of Sunderland, so I like that connection. Today at Sibelco, 800,000 metric tons of sand per year are extracted. So the other things on this slide, I did some research into forest glass makers, which I think that original John de Vere was would you call a forest glass maker. They originally came from France, and they brought technology of how to make glass using fluxes made from plants, which would lower the temperature of the sand, which actually has a very high melting point. So they'd use beechwood, bracken, and samphire, which some of you might know also has the name glasswort. So now you know why. With the advice of University of Sheffield Glass Research Centre staff, I experimented, and these are some of my experiments, with actually trying to make glass from some of the very small amount of the buckets of sand I got from Sibelco and plant ashes. And I kind of had in my mind the kind of artistic trend of using wild slips in ceramic and foraged inks, and getting a sense of place from the materials. But actually only the bracken and sand ones kind of remotely turned out like anything like glass, more like a glaze. And I realised that, well, apparently if I'd harvested the plant material earlier in the season, then it might have been a clearer glass that I ended up with, because it's seasonal. If you harvest in June, apparently that's the best time, then you get a higher level of potash, which is the material that lowers the temperature. And it's soda ash with the glasswort. So I don't think I'm going to be making my own glass in my kiln. I think it might have been better if I had a furnace, but that's not great for energy use and the climate. But it was a very interesting experiment, but not very practical. And so I'm going to continue to use ready-made glass cullet, recycled when possible. Am I all right on time? Recycling glass cullet, I'd kind of thought was something kind of quite new, but actually it's been going on for a long time. Okay, only 1 minute. Roman Phoenician civilizations, glass cullet was produced in huge glass hubs and then sent around their empires, around their colonies, and they were actually used to supplement local materials, even by the forest glass makers. And even medieval glass at Glastonbury Abbey, chemical analysis of that has shown that that was in part recycled Roman glass. When I was at Sibelco, I'm about to finish now. When I was at Sibelco, one of the staff spoke to me about the sand at the quarry running out in about 10 years and how Sibelco saw its future in recycled glass, which is great. However, even if you're recycling glass, if you want to make colourless glass, as in per windows, some silica sand still needs to be added to the recycled glass to keep the clarity. So if clear glass is still needed, there will continue to be the need for the extraction of sand. I think they've got planning permission. I don't know whether they've started to actually extract more at Borsey. You probably know. I know they've got planning permission recently, for the last few years. And I know that I think councils are starting to think about window glass recycling, because I don't know about around here, but in Suffolk you can't recycle window glass. No. And that seems actually dark. So that's me. I think I've finished. Thank you.
Thank you, Liz, very, very much indeed. And I'm sure you'll all join me in thanking our artists who've spoken this afternoon, each on their own materials and packaging. So what we need to do now is rearrange ourselves slightly, because Peter and Tim are going to talk a little bit now. Sorry, ladies, but you do stay nearby and answer questions and things. Liz, my parents live in a very old farmhouse, and some of the windows you can't see through because the glass has migrated slowly with gravity, and they're so completely swirled now that you can't see through them. I guess that's a firing thing. They were fired at lower temperature. Oh, conceivably, but they're unusable now as windows. I'll need to move between you chaps. Right. Our final session, as it were, we have Peter Lemon and our friend Tim Holgorsen. Peter.
Nick, can you turn the mics on and point them towards? Can you point it towards?
There we go. Peter, do you mind explaining who you are and what you do for everyone's understanding? There will be some people who haven't had the privilege of an artist in residency place and therefore haven't been able to go on a tour of your quarry with you.
Okay, well, I'm Peter Lemon, Managing Director of Middleton Aggregates. We operate 3 or 4 quarries in Norfolk. I'm King's Lynn lifer, so I've been here forever. I never knew that Samford was also called Glasswork, or why it was called Glasswork. So that's very new news to me.
I saw you Googling.
Oh yes, I Googled it. I've never heard that called Glasswork before. That's fantastic. So next time I'm eating some, I'm going to tell everybody why. So I was approached by Veronica the first time, was probably 3 or 4 years ago, to take 1 or 2 artists around the quarry, which I did. Then the next year, there might be 4 this year, and then I think it was 12. So it's grown, and I enjoy the enthusiasm that I see from the artists when they come around the quarries and look at things. I don't understand it, but I enjoy it. It's like herding cats, keeping them safe because they all scatter off in different directions and try and get themselves run over or fall off a cliff, which is obviously my biggest fear. But no, it has brought me considerable pleasure, although quite a lot of confusion.
You've answered my next question, which was going to be about the moments of, from your profoundly practical, people managing, health and safety, controlling world.
Yeah, well, I'm an engineer, not an artist, so this is all not my world. But
it has nonetheless, I'm sure, been an enriching experience.
Well, it is.
The very materials that you work with being experienced in an entirely different way.
Yeah. We make construction materials. We don't make art materials. We make things for people to build roads and houses and schools and what have you. And to see it as in some way an art material is totally different. So as I said, I don't necessarily understand it, but I'm really pleased that everybody else is drawing pleasure from it. And
I think it's obvious from the amount of people who've made reference to you today that the artists get an enormous amount from the experience of the landscape with you.
Especially when they get a dinosaur bone.
Especially when they get a mammoth tusk or a dinosaur bone. So, but before we come to you, Tim, another question for Peter. In your working life, how have you seen the industry change in terms of its sense of landscape as not just something you're mining the past, but actually handing something on to the future?
Massively. So I started working in this industry in 1986. Yes, I am that old. And
not yet a fossil. One day you'll be extracted. Yes. An artist in residence will pick you. This was Peter.
Well, we sold my dad's ashes, so we put them on the lorry, and they're on the A47 bypass.
Are they? I thought for a second Liz was going to say she would cast glass out of them all.
He would have found it very funny. I got £3 a tonne for him. Sorry. Yeah.
Lovely weather we're having.
When I started, the restoration of quarries was an afterthought. So you applied for planning permission, and maybe one day you might put in a restoration scheme. Now, the restoration is the leading part of any quarry application. So it's basically you have to be able to turn whatever you're digging into something better than it was. The new, particularly now with the latest regulations on biodiversity net gain, we have to improve biodiversity. There are always calls for sort of geological interest, faces to be left in places, but we are going to change the landscape, but we're not going to destroy it. That's basically it.
Fascinating stuff. Tim, you take a very long view of landscape. You have your emotional and psychological feet deep in ancient past, at a time pre-human and then right through human cultures up to the present. And you work in the preservation of that history and the preservation of the interface between that history and modern times.
I think of myself as a geoconservationist rather than a geologist. We've got so many biodiversity sites in East Anglia, but we've got very few geodiversity sites. And one of the things that I suppose, gained most of all from being part of the network and the gallery here has been taking sites which were in the Norfolk Geodiversity Audit that we did a few years ago, and then actually taking people around them and realising that's why we put them into the audit in the first place, because they're places of tremendous geological potential, and of course they overlap with biodiversity and archaeology as well. So they're places with many layers of meaning in them. And what the wonderful thing is when I take people around, we might go to Dursingham Bog and we see bacterial crusts in the peat, and then the next moment we're seeing cranberries and we're trying a cranberry to see what that tastes like. And so there's this kind of multi-layered approach to the geological landscape that I find very, very enriching when I can communicate it and share it with other people in such a way that it becomes a sort of yeast in their thought processes, their creative process, open little doors of inspiration that they can follow up and go further and develop new lines of engagement with the natural world, be it biological, geological, and also cultural, because let's put humans in their geological context, in their biological context as well.
And it's obvious you achieve inspiring people. You've been name-checked as an inspiration today more than anybody else. You've been the person who... And Tim opened my mind to this. I wonder, obviously you know each other now through groundwork, but when people like Peter are doing work in landscape, in a sense, there's tremendous opportunity there for you because you're peeling back layers that you wouldn't be able to peel back by yourself.
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, Peter has been fantastic, and his team have been absolutely fantastic in hosting various geological investigations of Pentney. And the Vivianite was just one amazing spin-off, which so I just suddenly said, oh, Vivianite, I've never seen it in such quantities. And I'm not kidding you, it was a whole stratum of pale blue running along at the base of the peak.
It's gone now.
And it's gone. It's been buried, but that's in the nature of things. It's in the nature of things to pass away and be transformed. But yeah, visiting the stone pile or just looking at the geological layers in the quarry, it's been one of the wonderful spin-offs, really, of engagement in this gallery process.
And that's your credit, Veronica, very much so. Yeah. Shall we give her a round of applause for everything she's done?
Can I ask a question of Peter?
No, not 25 next year.
No, right.
That was going to be...
We'll discuss that.
She's like a geological process. Resistance is never the answer.
I'm very curious, having started this whole extraction process inspired by this terrible, well, you weren't there at the beginning, but this terrible experience in the United States where there's really reckless devastation of land that isn't repaired afterwards. So what's the standing of your practice in this country internationally? Are you an
I
exemplary?
think this country is one of the best in the world. I mean, there are huge areas of the States, Africa, Australia that are just completely denuded. Hydraulic mining, there's all sorts of mining practices that are pretty appalling, and including the waste disposal from the quarry. So you've got, you know, tailings dams that collapse and sludge buries whole villages of people, and so there is some pretty awful practices. But we are amongst the most regulated, which is difficult for us, but it's, you know, it's important for the sustainability of the industry that we are probably the most. I don't know too much about European practice, if I'm honest, but I'm betting most of Northern Europe is on a similar level to the UK. I think some of Southern Europe is, having been on holiday a few times, Spain and Italy, is not quite so well controlled.
And what's the scrutiny mechanism?
The regulation is, well, the scrutiny starts with the planning application, and regular visits from the county council, planning authority, and from the Environment Agency. So you've got two levels of scrutiny.
Can I just riff off that, thinking back to what Lucy was saying at the end of the first half before lunch? Has anyone here not read Robin Wall Kimmerer? No. Oh, okay. Homework for everybody who hasn't read Robin Wall Kimmerer. Go buy today. Extraordinary writer, a Potawatomi Indigenous woman and a modern scientist, and she came into having done her degrees on mosses. She actually came into being a restoration ecologist through working with moss to restore damaged landscapes in the US, where she describes horrors of a nature that we don't see in this landscape. Yeah.
Well, we have had them in the past. I mean, a lot of the coal mining works and the iron works were very poor. Some of the big slate quarries were very poor, but a lot of them have found a second life and been brought back to something useful.
And indeed, there are projects going on today. The OSPB is working in lots of quarried land in Finland, restoring large and internationally important wetlands.
75% of triple SIs in the UK are quarry sites.
75%.
Yeah.
Good grief! What a statistic! Yeah. What a statistic!
Can I ask a question? If you think because we're a small island, that the importance of actually restoring is emphasised because it can't be hidden. You can encounter it. I mean, I remember going to Canada, and we went to visit the lakes in Canada, and we had to drive for a whole day to get to the other side. And it was sort of just vast distances. So quarries in Canada or America are hidden away from the majority of people, whereas in the UK, you can quickly get to here, there and everywhere. So if there is a big hole in the land, people are going to make a fuss about it pretty quickly. And also there's been terrible disasters. And I wonder if that's why it's become so important in the UK to actually regenerate
I think it is very important. I think we will, I don't say we will run out, but it's getting increasingly difficult to find quality deposits of aggregates from a commercial point of view. Sibelco is a great example. It started on a real scale by bone. I think it was 1880, somebody said. I know it was bone to start with, then it became BIS and then various other names. But so they've been quarrying there for 150 years, but they're running into the villages. They've sort of run into Lesia, they've run into Ballsey, they're running into Eastwinch. They just can't go much further. So it will ultimately run out, and there aren't other suitable deposits available.
So they're just going to have to become incredibly good at reusing existing materials rather than...
We're going to have to be better at recycling. We're going to have to use materials more carefully, but we import more. So Norway is for sale by the ton, and is coming into Great Yarmouth docks at the rate of 1 million tonnes a year from a Norwegian field, and you wouldn't notice it in Norway. I mean, Norway is an enormous country with 6 million people in it, so you can dig the side of the field out and nobody really cares. But it's that's granite in the main that's coming in, because in East Anglia we're running out of gravel, coarse materials. We've got plenty of sand, but we're short of gravel.
One of the things that I noticed when I visited Peters was one of the old quarries has been back-mounded with municipal rubbish.
Yeah.
And there's also, there's municipal rubbish, and there's which is sort of domestic stuff, and then there's also inert waste, which is sort of lumps of concrete and bits and bobs. And of course, if you taking my monstrous geological perspective, scroll forward a few million years, and these deposits are going to be the most amazing fossil deposits. They're going to be these interesting layers. Back in 20 years ago, I was Garbology Project Officer for the Suffolk County Council, was basically pioneering the use of rubbish as a waste awareness and heritage learning resource. And one of my tasks was to go out and try and find interesting dumps for people to excavate. And
future people or current people?
There's a guy called both actually. Yeah, but there's a guy called Jan Zalasiewicz who he chaired, I think, the Anthropocene Working Group of the International Commission on Stratigraphy, and he wrote a paper, a bit of a spoof, which is called Brunaspis Enigmatica, and it's written from the point of view of an archaeologist thousands and thousands of years in the future who comes across deposits from our age and finds these weird fossils that they have no idea how to interpret. And they call one of them Brunaspis Enigmatica, and they really don't know what it is. I think it's not even a kipper or something like that. I think there's this dimension of what the future is going to make of our age as well. Are we going to be mining glass? Is it time to start mining glass, cull it, to do things with? What about plastics? In a world where we can't process gas and oil because of its environmental impacts. Well, what about recycling some of the plastics? What can we do with them? Can we shred them into little things and then compact them in a block and make houses out of them? So there are lots of possibilities. And Peter's got everything in his, ranging from wonderful glass to sandstone to clay to peat to rubbish.
Well, we're trespassing now on the time. You need a coffee break, a tea break, so we'll wrap up here with the thought that Peter's given us of the neighbouring quarry, not your quarry, which is literally eating to the edge of its resource and trespassing on human communities, which really is the message. As someone who teaches about the environment, the message that I'm teaching the whole time, that we need to stop consuming quite so much, and bear in mind that this is a limited planet, and however much of Norway there is, sooner or later we'll run out of stuff. So with tremendous thanks to Peter and to Tim, go have tea.
Okay, so we started to look at how our actions in our country reach out and damage and extract from other countries, and therefore we can't necessarily draw a line where the UK ends and say, for instance, we've got good practices here, but people over there haven't got good practices, because quite often we outsource our pollution or our extraction or sending our plastic off to somewhere else to say that it's been recycled when it hasn't. So we started to look at how that's a kind of a chain, and we had the suggestion of a question, which isn't very cheery, of how do we break a chain of misery? So we were looking at then that there are models of regenerative and reciprocal practices, but how can we share these? How can we spread them when certain people have all the land or seem to have all the power or all the money? How can we make time and land and other resources available to communities so that they can develop some of these practices, basically? That's a shortened version.
Very good. Excellent thinking. I think you need to reframe your wording of your question, because it could apply to anything. I think it needs to be more specific. Okay, very good. To you. Next.
I think I've been left holding the microphone. We had a wide-ranging discussion and started off with talking about waste, reusing waste, and the extent to which we can transform it. And then we started on a discussion which centred around Peter's very interesting comment that 75% of SSSIs in Britain were in quarries. And when I suppose a lot of the publicity about extraction is very negative, there is a very positive story to tell as well. And that led us on to talking about biodiversity. The fact that there is a biodiversity associated with acid mine waste and the like, which is very interesting. It's not cuddly, but it's bacteria, and they're very interesting bacteria. And we then started talking about the change in biodiversity in Britain, the losses and the gains, and where we're aiming for. We talked about the importance of regulation in improving the environment, which obviously departments like DEFRA and the Environment Agency are important for. But then I guess in terms of a question, Tim sort of started talking about Earth heritage, and we sort of had a discussion then around a question about which elements do we want to pass on to future generations. So there are decisions that we can make now about what we want to pass on. There may be things that we're willing to let go, but there are certain things presumably that are more precious to us than others that we are willing to pass on.
Choice. But yeah, very good. I understand from one of the geologists that gave a talk a few years ago, one of the founders of the Anthropocene. It's a very odd effect, this mic, isn't it? Sorry, what? Because you're standing just next to the speaker. Chicken bones is apparently, that's your subject. Chicken bones we're going to pass on. And since the 1980s, chicken bones have quadrupled in size. And there's going to be a layer of chicken bones in the next geological layer.
Okay. We had a really wide-ranging conversation as well, speaking about similar things, like how maybe ruined landscapes can foster other forms of life and still become ecosystems, but maybe in a different sort of way. So like how rubbish dumps might become sites for wildlife, for instance. And then we had quite a wide-ranging debate about so-called invasive species and how one should manage that, and a discussion about wildlife conservation versus animal rights versus animal welfare, and how these things come into relationships in the ethics and debate about resolving effective ways to respond. Anything else?
We should rename invasive species migratory species, because migration is natural and invasion is sort of, it's a human thing that people do to go and invade spaces. I'm not sure that animals do it, they just migrate and go somewhere else.
Basically, we were inspired by Veronica's ladybird infested loft.
Also, there was the what was the bit that you were saying about what legislation is there for regeneration? So you were giving an example of a site that wildlife had come to and seemed to be regenerating on its own, and then a body came in and said, no, you've got to do it this way.
Very good. It'd be good if somebody on the table would hold on to some of that process, because we don't want to end up just with sound bites, but you've clearly been having such interesting conversation.
I'm rather sort of dreading this because it became quite contentious. We picked up on the transportation of land after, is it Peter, with the quarry, and we were saying about land being imported, and some of us were comfortable with it and some of us were not. Yes. And not only, the fact that the land was being brought, but then the cost in transportation and the effects of that. And that went on to talking about population, because obviously we're a denser population here. We have got quite a few, so I am going to give you sound bites and you can then follow the trail, hopefully. And then that went on to discussing about the quarries. the ecological impact. Oh yes, and we brought in, then went to the extremities of mining on the moon. And so we're all quite happy to send Elon Musk to the dark side of the moon. And
What he comes back with.
yes, well, he can stay there with his bucket and spade, and the effects of mining the moon, and would that then change the whole gravitation? And we went on to water affecting the Earth's gravitational spin. Silica dust, we were talking, the quarry, and then somebody, I'm not pointing fingers, but we all took part in this, and it was noticed that in the room, the majority of artists present are all female, and the experts are all male. And so we have posed the question, why? I'm not going to give you our feedback or answers, but that's our question to the room. We've then got a little bit, how did we get on about picking plants?
You were saying about you're uncomfortable about picking plants.
Yes, gathering.
Yeah. The ethics of gathering.
Gathering. So we would then have a discussion about relating to the plant and actually seeing if it's willing to give you a piece of it, if you're gently exploring, asking permission rather than ripping its head off. And then we were talking about when you go to choose fruit, you usually give it a little tug or wiggle if it comes off in your hand. We're seeing that that's the plant, or actually gesturing to you. Is that everything? We've got another here. Was this 75 quarrying before or after it was made an SSI?
Yeah, it was.
That's yours.
No, it was just a question because I really don't know. Were the 75% of SSSIs being quarries, was it a quarry before it was made an SSSI or after? Okay.
It's restored quarries.
Okay.
75% of triple SIs are in restored quarries.
Okay, because there's also a 39% of SSSIs are not in good condition. So let's put that piece there too. Yes. There are lots of questions. That's good.
So thank you. That's our sound bites. I'm sorry, but.
Yeah. The eagle-eyed will have spotted earlier drafts of the programme where Liz Hyde was going to chair the afternoon, by the way, and she couldn't. Yeah. So she couldn't come after all. So there would have been one other woman. Tomorrow we've got Fabia Pollard, who's a star.
And I guess the question is also, what are we assuming to be expert?
Yeah, quite.
Where that is suggesting that artists aren't experts.
Well, exactly. And actually, I think this room is absolutely jam-packed full of experts. And I think that what we're discussing proves it.
Then we've answered that question positively.
Yes. Okay.
Thank you. We covered loads of very exciting issues. So I was on a table of artists and makers, and so we ended up, not intentionally, but very much focusing on the impacts of making. We decided that a lot of making is simply moving stuff around. Sometimes you can recover it and sometimes you can't. It's displacement. We talked about waste and how in our society we have quite a casual-ish sort of approach to waste, the nature of using things and then putting them down or throwing them away, the politics of sending our waste abroad to other countries for them to deal with it. And we discovered that I think it was quite a common feeling that even when we were using found objects and giving them a new life, that there's quite a profound sense of guilt about the impact that we're having environmentally. And that's something that we're all grappling with and trying to find our own way through to still be able to make, because that's part of who we are, what gives us life and how we feel that we want to bless others or engage others, and yet still not trash the world while we're doing it. We had a really big conversation around ceramics, because there were quite a few ceramicists at this table, about how firing materials uses energy. So, for example, I use porcelain occasionally in very small amounts because I love using porcelain. It would be sad to decide to never use porcelain again. So my way round is to just use very tiny amounts, use a green energy tariff to fire on, but I'm still aware that I'm having an impact. And yet I'm standing here saying I care about the environment. It's difficult. Talk to this gentleman about glazing using toothpastes, because it's fascinating. We talked as well about how we would never have had this conversation 20 years ago, that those of us that were at art college 20 years ago or further back, that these debates just weren't really around. And then we got on to, following on from the guilt, we got on to the fact that a lot of the things that we treasure from past civilizations are things that people have made, that artists or makers have made, that is a part of being human, that humans need to create, that perhaps in past centuries the creation was more around a need to survive, so you were creating through your cooking, your foraging, your storing, you're building a house, you're making your clothes. Perhaps for them creation came out in a different way to how it does for some of us now, but it's a fundamental thing. Alongside another comment that we are as the asteroid, we as in humans, are as the asteroid was for the dinosaurs. But we ended up with the point that creativity benefits and enriches lives, and we don't want to stop. We just need to think about how.
Very good. Well, big applause all round for everybody. Oh, you haven't done.
Hang on, we've got no. Somebody's attached at the other end. I'm undoing somebody's trouser leg. We started. I'm trying to build a question that that's going to be good, which I think. Okay, so we talked about extraction, our reaction to extraction. We talked about different methods of extraction, and for example, the extracting of data, and then we talked about AI scraping and how the words are used from the physical into the digital. We talked about techno-feudalism. And I don't feel like I can speak about that. We talked about positive net gain, and wouldn't it be interesting to ask about what the positive net gain might be if we asked techno giants what they were going to put in first in the way that the man spoke about his quarry. And we have two book suggestions, Ed Conway and Stefano Barca, Workers of the Earth. That was your reading list from us. How do we get to a post-extractive society was our question. And then we came up with a sentence which was, what is more poetic than running out of time, running out of sand? Than running out of sand.
Is that right? Yeah. We're running out of sand, running out of time. Right. So I suppose the question could be, what do we do when the sand runs out?
Just flip the arrow button.
Just flip it over.
Oh, don't get clever.
And a very big thanks to Henry, who's appropriately had the last word. Yeah, that's the.
Maybe a thank you to Veronica for putting the music on so we could decide to dance or not.